Good morning to everyone present here. We are delighted this morning to welcome 11 schools out of 15 who have participated in this unique event that was conceptualized by our director, Mrs. Amita Prasad, and it was entitled R.K.Laxman, the Uncommon Man. We came upon this because we found that, interestingly enough, this year happens to be the birth centenary of this genius that we know as R.K. Lakshman. And for all of us, I mean, people of our generation, what we were absolutely attuned to and we looked forward to in the newspaper every day, possibly is something that youngsters who are in school today really did not get an opportunity to see. And we thought, why not ignite that interest in these young minds? Because Lakshman's work is something that we can learn from every single day. It is not something that has dated. It is not something that has gotten frozen in time. In fact, some of his cartoons seem even more relevant today. Today is the penultimate day of our event. Actually, this fest was designed in such a way that students got to explore various facets of Lakshman's work. And we had entries from 15 schools of the city for cartooning that was inspired by Lakshman's original cartoons. We also had a photography category that was inspired by a quote from Lakshman. And we had artwork that was, again inspired by Lakshman's crows. So we have had a galaxy of judges who have given off their precious time to judge those events. And very soon we will be sharing the results with all the schools. But this morning is a very, very special morning for all of us present here because we have amidst us Dr. Samantak Das, the Pro Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University. Uh, and I think I will leave it to my colleague, Mrs. Prasad, to introduce Dr. Das to all our young friends who are present on this virtual platform with us. So, Mrs. Prasad, it's over to you now.
Thank you very much. And I think you've given me a rather hard task to do. Introducing Professor Das is not easy. But I'll keep it very simple. And I'm sure this morning's lecture will be his best introduction. Professor Das is a name to reckon with in the field of higher education in Kolkata and beyond. He was a reader in English at Vishwabharati University, and in Jadavpur University, he has been a professor in the Department of Comparative Literature. Uh, he has been the head of department, but I think most of all, he's been a much admired and much loved teacher. His students find his lectures unforgettable. In September last month, he was appointed Pro Vice Chancellor, as you just heard, and I'm sure he'll do a fantastic job in his new role. And we wish Professor Das all the best in this new role. But apart from his teaching work, Professor Das regularly writes in the editorial pages of the print media. And I, for one, eagerly look forward to reading his pieces in the Telegraph because there is always so much thought that he puts into his writing. Uh, and the depth of his uh, ideas and his inimitable writing style is something which sets him apart. But apart from all this, Professor Das does not confine his work to the rarefied atmosphere of academia. He also has a very strong social consciousness. And I know from my past interactions that he is deeply involved with some excellent work with different NGOs. So Professor Das, in many ways, is a tremendous source of inspiration for all of us. Thank you very much once again, Professor, for agreeing to join us on this platform. And it's over to you.
Thank you. That is technically known as a setup, because you say good things about a person and then he sort of falls flat on his face. And so yeah, forgive that little bit of levity. When I was first asked to speak about R.K.Laxman, I wondered how to go about it. And then I discovered that you are having a fest, I suppose, uh, totally dedicated to the work of uh, undoubtedly the most influential Indian cartoonist of the last century. In fact, even this century, because he lived till 2015. And so, what I would like to do today is uh, probably going to be familiar to a lot of you, especially those of you who've been following the fest, reading his works, looking at his pictures, and so on and so forth. And I will be trying to, present you with some images and maybe some texts of his writings and so on and so forth. And uh, much more than my speaking, I would be more interested, really, if I could respond to some of your queries and questions. I assume that amongst you, and by you I mean, the students, uh, you have some who are themselves aspiring or established cartoonists. In school, and my old school, I can see several of uh, the lads from my old school, La Martine, who are present here. And the- at least during the time when I was a student there, things like drawing and cartooning and so on and so forth were frowned upon. They were seen as being somehow unmanly, and some of the very fine illustrators that we had amongst our friends never really took it up with any degree of seriousness. Fortunately, Rasipuram Krishnaswamy Lakshman, the RK stands for Rasipuram Krishnaswamy, for all of the six brothers who were there, including his elder brother, who was about 15 years older than him, R.K. Narayan. Uh, they were never really discouraged. And although their father was a very stern headmaster, he never really bothered when it came to his sons and daughters to scold them if they were up to if they failed to live up to the high academic standards that he was trying to enforce elsewhere. I wonder, have you read his autobiography? um, I'm asking the students. It's really worth reading his autobiography, um, which is called The Tunnel of Time, because um, it, it's it's something that we can all kind of take inspiration from, as to how somebody who was not a particularly brilliant student, who in fact failed his school finals because he couldn't pass in Kannada and then had to go and get a private tutor and get coaching for a year, who had poor results, who was refused admission to the JJ School of Art, nevertheless became undoubtedly, um, by whatever metric you measure his success, the most successful Indian cartoonist that we've ever had. So I think let me begin by presenting you some of his cartoons, just as a kind of introduction to his work, and maybe I will comment on these as we go along. Can you see this? Uh, is this visible? Uh,
Yes, sir.
Yes, Dr. Das, it is.
Yes,
yes.
sir.
Yes.
It's visible.
Yeah. Okay. Now,
Professor.
yeah, if yeah, who has raised a hand? Yeah, Brishti Brahma. Yeah. You want to
Sir,
say
I did
something,
it by
Rishikesh?
mistake. I did it by mistake. I'm
Yeah,
very
yeah, okay,
sorry for
fine, fine,
that.
fine. Yeah, okay. And if you want to ask anything, just speak. Because I will not be able to see raised hands when I present.
Yes, sir.
Okay,
Yes.
so,
Sure, sir.
so this is from the fourth volume of the Best of Lakshman, published in 1995. And the first one, you can see the cartoon, and with everything being having foreign collaboration these days, some skeptic thinks this new statue is actually Ben Kingsley. Ben Kingsley, as you probably know, is the person who acted as Gandhi in the film by Richard Attenborough. To the right, you will see his immortal creation, the common man. The next one is about a typical Neta. Find out whose birth or death anniversary it is today. Mention he was a great patriot and did much to help the poor, etc. And release the statement to the press. And the third one, I am worried. He's acting peculiar. He's reading a book and not watching the TV, saying he's tired of sex, violence, and vulgarity. I suppose one could replace the TV screen with a computer monitor. And you note again that the common man is present there. Um, why should he get the best parliamentarian award? I have walked out 273 times and he only 104. Now, when you look at uh, the cartoons, I'm just going to quickly scroll through them without reading out what's said there. There are some things which are noticeable. Um, I'll just take you quickly through a few of them. I want you particularly to notice the expression on the face of the common man. Uh, if you look at his expression, you will see that it is one of sort of eternal perplexity, kind of wide out. There's an emoji that a lot of us use on our WhatsApp chats, which has this round face with two eyes looking, goggle-eyed at the screen, and that's the first thing that I want you to notice. I'm sure you have. As I said, I doubt I'll be saying any new things. The second thing that you note is the cleanness of his lines, even when he is like, for example, this one, even when he's presenting a scene with a lot of elements in it, you will see that uh, it's done very neatly. There's a kind of almost geometric precision in the way in which elements are arranged. Look at this one, uh, or this, or this, you know. And the third element that I want you to note is the kind of gentleness of the humor. It is not something which is very bitter. In fact, that is one of the charges that was laid against uh, Lakshman by some of his fellow cartoonists, who said that uh, he was simply not uh, political enough in his cartooning. So maybe I'll stop after the next couple of um, next couple of I was about to say slides, but these are really pages. And in all of these, uh, politicians, powerful figures, the state, and the state administration, if you like, are are the are the butt of his jokes. Now, the interesting thing about Lakshman is that he did this for almost 60 years. And when you look at Lakshman, something that we uh, perhaps tend to forget is the sheer hard work that went into what he did. If you've read his autobiography, or if you've read any biographical accounts of his work, he would be at his desk at the Times of India, which he joined in 1951, if I remember correctly, and stayed right up to the end of his life at 8:30 in the morning. And he would uh, tell people that he was not to be disturbed, and he would go through all the papers to come up with the idea for the next day's cartoon. And by about 4 o'clock or 4:30, he had completed it. And it's quite remarkable to think that he did this day in and day out for decades. Initially he started out by doing a cartoon every alternate day and a little strip of three, and then it became a regular feature. You said it, which would appear, those of us who are much older than than most of the audience will remember opening the Times of India, and that was pretty much the first thing that you looked at on the first page. Uh, you said it by R.K.Laxman, and invariably there would be the common man and some kind of commentary. Now, what made that fascinating is that this was never something which was dated, and this was something which would always refer to contemporary events, but with a kind of larger context that he built in. So if there was the Bofors scandal, for example, he would not only talk about the Bofors, he would talk about graft, he would talk about corruption, he would talk about the tragic fact that things like defense were actually being used to line the pockets of politicians, and so on and so forth. Now, where does this come from, and how did it happen? I'm just wondering, uh, have you read his autobiography? Could somebody here tell me if you've read his autobiography? Because then I will skip reading out this bit. Anyone? How many of you have read his autobiography? Has his autobiography been discussed? Has it been discussed?
No, sir. I
Okay.
would request you to please
Okay. Yeah.
not
Okay.
assume that. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. Wonderful. Then I shall quickly mm, take you through a few pages um, of his autobiography. Um, and this has to do with um, the way in which his cartoons influenced people. Now, as I said, you had this cartoon on the front page, and it often became a kind of lens or prism through which the readers of the Times of India looked at the world. Um, there are research papers and theses waiting to be written uh, on the ways in which the cartoons of R.K. Laxman influenced the reading habits or the creation of interests or otherwise of his readers. Now, here there's a caveat in that I've already said that Lakshman has been criticized by fellow cartoonists, like Thailang, Sudhir Dar, and others, for not being political enough, not being, sharp enough, not being satirical enough, perhaps. The other charge that can be laid uh, at the door of R.K.Laxman is that he wrote for, well, essentially for people like us, you know, urban, English reading, middle class. Although many of his cartoons, especially in the last 3 decades, were also translated into many regional languages. One reason why this could be done is because if you look at his cartoons, there are never any speech bubbles in his cartoons. There may the only text that you get in his cartoons are things like street signs, shop signs, newspaper headlines. That is something which occurs with increasing frequency. But I shouldn't say increasing frequency. I haven't done the done the calculation, but it's there. Newspapers are almost like a character in the Lakshman cartoons. They'll be there, and it's never uh, real newspapers, so to speak. It's just headlines which are there. So amongst those that we saw, you saw plague, riots, and so on and so forth. So newspapers would be there, and those can be left in, but the main punchline, as it were, is always outside of the cartoon. So whatever somebody is saying is what used to be printed at the bottom of the cartoon, so which makes it relatively easier to translate. I mean, if you have a speech bubble there, then you know those of us who've seen Bangla or Hindi translations of Tintin or Asterix or whatever, we know that sometimes it's kind of mm, slightly how shall I put it, unintentionally funny in the way in which these are translated. But uh, in Lakshman's case, translations were readily available. But as I was saying, in Lakshman, uh, there was, despite this, it is something that was meant, largely for, as I said, PLU, people like us, urban, um, middle to upper middle class English reading, but with a social conscience, but with a kind of awareness of the larger world outside. In fact, that is again something which it is possible to speculate about, which is how did the cartoons of Lakshman influence individuals like us who are basically city dwellers to think about problems which may not have impacted their lives directly. So, for example, you lived in a city, you had a comfortable existence. Why would you bother about villages? Why would you bother about poverty? Why would you bother about the urban poor? And I feel that it may have been because of this almost unrelenting barrage of images that Lakshman created. Every day you would come across images of, laborers toiling away in building the very same houses in which we lived or live, uh, rural, poverty, the ways in which the city looked at the village, or the wealthy and powerful looked at the poor and dispossessed. And guiding the vision was always the common man. I wish I could show you some more pictures uh, to kind of illustrate or try and prove my contention that the figure of the common man and the eyes of the common man are ways to direct the way in which we read a cartoon. Each one of Lakshman's cartoons tells a little story. So you when you've got that first image that I showed you of the statue, and Lakshman gets rid of the top of the statue. You can't actually see the head of the statue. It's Gandhi because you've got the dhoti and the plinth and so on and so forth. And the common man is not really looking up at the statue, but he's listening to what the other person is saying. Similarly, in another instance, the common man is outside of the room where some kind of discussion is going on, presumably amongst netas with their Gandhi topis and so on and so forth. And it's as if he's trying to look in, but is excluded. There's this kind of invisible barrier which keeps the common man away from what is really happening. And you kind of get the sense that maybe the common man can't even hear what is being said. We are being given privileged access because the perspective of the cartoon is from within the room. So from inside the room, you can see. Shall I display that once again, or let it be? You can look it up. There are many such. So it is as if we are a fly on the wall inside the room. In front of us, there's a desk or a table with the people around it. They are saying something, and in the background, through the door, you can see the common man at a distance, diminished by perspective. He's sort of looking in. And that, of course, is exactly how we feel when we think about the kinds of discussions and the kinds of deliberations which lead to certain government decisions. I've often thought, what would the common man or what would Lakshman have done in terms of the cartoon when it comes to recent events like demonetization, for example? Who took the decision? How was the decision taken, and so on? What was at the back of the heads of people? And of course, citizenship and all of the other, politically fraught issues of our time. Who took the decision to impose a nationwide lockdown at 4 hours notice? How would he have, not only looked at it, but how would he have kind of guided us on looking at it? I think this is something that those of you who are seriously interested in cartooning can take up. What does the common man do? The common man is not just a character. He's a kind and a representative of the common man, man in this case, including women as well. Lakshman incidentally was once asked, why don't you have a common woman? And he was also charged, I think not without some justification, for being a bit of a patriarch, because the common man is a man, and the women in most of his cartoons have very traditional roles. They are housewives, or they are mothers, or they are poor urban laborers, and so on and so forth. Be that as it may, one notable exception of course being Indira Gandhi, but she was far more representative of political power than of her gender. Anyway, so coming back to the way in which the common man was a sort of guide to us, literally, telling us which way, as it were, to read the cartoon. I think those of you who are aspiring cartoonists can look at three things in Lakshman's cartoons, which might help you to become cartoonists or help you to interpret cartoons so that you can use that better. The first is he stuck to a kind of what I call a modified realist mode of representation. That is to say, there is perspective in his art. It is realistic in the sense that it is not kind of fantastical. There are no dragons or dinosaurs except as museum exhibits in any of his cartoons. It is a recognizably Indian world, whether of the city or of the village, whether of a construction site or the or a statue or the houses of parliament. And it is always drawn in perspective, and the figures who are there occupy certain interesting planes. If you remember that one cartoon I paused on, where the mother is saying in a worried tone to the father that I wonder what's happened to him. He stopped watching television, he's reading books, because he says, now you see that the subject of their discussion is in another room, behind what is happening in the foreground. So the foreground, the midground, and the background are all used brilliantly by Lakshman. I think a lot of the people who criticized him hadn't actually analyzed his cartoons in such a way which would enable them to understand the sheer artistry that went into it. He was very much of a cerebral cartoonist, is in the sense that each one of his cartoons, as I said, tells a story, has a narrative, but it also makes a point. Now, you may or may not agree with that point, but it is there. And the perspective also is something that if you look at his cartoons again, it's not always from the same level. Sometimes it's as if he's looking at, especially for netas, from below, so they appear larger than life. They're these large figures dominating the thing, as if it's the little guy, the little person who's being overawed, looking up. That's what happens. If you remember, you will probably remember this better than Amitadi or Rajuda or others, which is, when we were children, our parents or elders have a larger than life appearance simply because we see them from the perspective of 2.5 or 3 feet, which is how tall we are. And then as we grow older, they kind of literally diminish in size. So Lakshman would use this. But his cartoons were also looked at for another reason, which I had no idea about, which he talks about in his autobiography. So if you'll allow me, I'll just quickly present this little section. Um, can you see this? This is from
Yes, sir.
Tunnel of Time, an autobiography which was published in 1998. So he was 77 years old at that time. And he says, another offbeat incident revealed that my cartoons, beside provoking laughter, had a mystic appeal to a section of the public. So at that time, gambling on numbers was growing in Bombay, as it was then, Mumbai. These people somehow saw the possible lucky combination of numbers in my cartoons. It went roughly along these lines. Suppose there were 4 people in the cartoon on a particular day, with 3 looking one way and 1 the other way. That somehow provided sufficient clues for the gamblers to speculate accordingly. Again, suppose a minister's table displayed 3 telephone instruments and 2 of the minister's fingers were visible. Well, it was yet another pointer to prosperity. Thus, the number of lampposts, cars in a street scene, people in a bus queue were all indicators to where the treasure lay. One morning, a fat fellow who looked like a trader, clad in an immaculate white kurta and dhoti, with a gold chain adorning his neck. Notice the details. Fat fellow, looking like a trader, immaculate white kurta and dhoti, gold chain adorning his neck. And just these details allow us to conjure up a kind of mental image of the man. He was waiting for my arrival at the office. He took out a sheaf of high-denomination currency notes and offered it to me, asking in return for the favor of just one glimpse of the following morning's cartoon. This would help him to read the mysterious number hidden in it and thus gamble ahead of his rivals and make his fortune. It was not difficult to get rid of this customer. All I had to do was bring up imaginary legal objections to such a transaction, and so on and so forth. And of course, the moment he said it, he this man left. Immediately after this, Lakshman goes on to talk about how he kept being invited to speak and how petrified he was about public speaking. But then he went and did in his speeches what he would do in his cartoons, which is look at the world from a particular perspective, and he became incredibly popular. So I don't want to talk about his life and so on and so forth, which I'm sure you know about, but I do want to draw your attention to one book by Lakshman, which I wonder if you have read it. It's called Servants of India. Have any of you read this book, Servants of India? Okay, let me present this to you. And despite the fact that this is being recorded, I can say that if you are a good web pirate, you know where you can find this. So you can still buy it. It's probably out of print. So let me again present this to you, because in a way it sums up all of the things that I was saying about R.K.Laxman. So let me see if I can do this. I've been lucky so far in that I haven't messed up the sharing bit. Okay. Can you see?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Okay, wonderful. So this is a book that was published by Penguin in India. I, why am I not being able to do this? Yeah. Um, and it's got little sort of character sketches um, of, Keshav the handyman, um, Swami the cook, and if I don't have a great deal of time um, to read out from this. Yeah, okay. Himraj Chakraborty, you've raised a hand.
Sir, I am
Uh,
sorry to interrupt, but is
yeah,
Ishwaran the storyteller also a part of this book?
Ishwaran the storyteller. Yeah, this is. Oops. Um, are we back to the servants? These are told from the perspective of a chap called Ganesh. You know, Ganesh was completing an article. He was a freelance journalist, and this is something that happens. No, not each one. Ganesh is the person who is a kind of alter ego of Lakshman's, and he talks about the cooks and the handymen,
Mhm.
who are there. And you notice that um, there are these servants wonderfully sketched. Shanti the maid, for example, uh, and each one of them has not only the picture of that individual servant, but also sometimes a little scene. And then there's Kumar, the actor, who was actually a cook, and you have another scene which illustrates an event there. And there's Parvati the Aya, Anthony the chauffeur, Ishwaran the storyteller. This is the one which has Ishwaran the storyteller. This chapter, I think that
Sir,
answers. Yeah.
sir, I have a question that is it
Yeah.
influenced from his real life?
Difficult. Just hang on. Just 1 minute. The phone singing. I'll just quickly attend to it. Just a minute.
Sure, sir.
Sorry. Yes, you're back. You were asking a question.
Yes, sir. I was asking that whether it is influenced from his real life or not.
Yes, yes. Every author will tell you that everything that they're writing is sort of influenced from or taken from their lives, but but um, the uh, the characters who are here and the incidents that are described, uh, you know, I don't think all of them happened to Lakshman or his family, his wife, or his brothers, or so on and so forth, in exactly the same way. He has taken the artistic license that anyone uh, can take. Now, when you read Servants of India, and I'm sorry I blundered on Iswaran, the storyteller, because I thought you were asking whether it's Iswaran who's telling the story. But yeah, it is here. When you look at uh, a book like this, it is something which precisely, I think, tells us about the strengths as well as, uh, let's say, if not the failings, let's say the absences in Lakshman's art. What are the strengths? The strengths are this wonderful ability to sketch, in all senses of the terms, uh, the characters whom he represents there, in terms of their physical features, their ways of speaking, their mannerisms, and so on and so forth. The weakness, of course, is that they never really become full-fledged, what we would call rounded human beings. They are, as the uh, name suggests, always servants, those who serve the author, or in this case, Ganesh, and and what they do. They come from outside, and they are seen, from the perspective from which I suspect many of us uh, see the people who work as, domestic helps in our homes. That is to say, we are polite enough with them, we interact, uh, you know, whilst acknowledging their human dignity, but somewhere there is this kind of us and them division when it comes to the way in which we look at such individuals. They are off, and yet they are outside the world that we inhabit. And I think if you look at his other works, there's a fine earlier work called the Hotel Riviera, which talks actually in terms of. Let me just show you this wonderful little little cartoon. The cartoon cover of the Hotel Riviera. Yeah. Okay. Can you see this? Yep. Can you see this? Yeah.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
So this is the Hotel Rivera, uh, based on the hotel that he stayed in when he started working in the times of India, and it also has a little autobiographical piece of how he didn't know any English, and studied initially in a Kannada medium school. And then he has these small, rather lovely stories which are there. Um, Again, something which is worth reading. And I think this is actually quite a lovely picture. You know, again, you note uh, the the attention to detail. This would be. I don't even know whether any of you have been to such quote unquote hotels, which are more like lodges or boarding houses. There will be the calendar with some deity or the other on it, some kind of framed certificate, the little sign at the back, the manager, proprietor, cup of tea, some cold drink bottle in front. Wonderful, attention to detail. But again, when you read the Hotel Rivera, when you read a book like Servants of India, um, then um, you see how Lakshman is looking at things from a particular perspective. This is again a charge. I don't say it's a charge. This is again that can be something which is said about Narayan. Narayan has also been his dada, his elder brother, has also been charged with not being sufficiently political, kind of skimming the surface in a way. And there is some truth to the ways in which people have been, you know, um, talking about the work both of Narayan and of Lakshman. Uh, there are many authors in many countries whose satires are far more direct, um, far more, uh, shall we say, aggressive in many ways. Um, the nature of the comedy in Lakshman, as in Narayan, is kind of gentle. There are very few of his cartoons which express outrage, for example, which you would find in someone like Robert Crumb, or in more recent times, creators of uh, longer graphic narratives like Marjane Satrapi, whose Persepolis is there, Joe Sacco's Palestine, and many others. In fact, Lakshman never uh, created an extended strip. These are all moments. They are like a couple of minutes of looking at something. The kind of broad narrative sweep that you find in graphic narratives. Think about, for example, the Sandman series, created by Neil Gaiman, illustrated by many artists. That is missing in Laxman. But I think his greatest gifts to us were the following. The first was a certain humanity which pervades all of his works. You may not uh, make the attempt to get to know a servant or a common person of the street or a sweeper or you know a daily wage laborer or a villager uh, in any great detail, but that does not prevent you from looking at them as fellow human beings who have rights and who deserve a certain kind of you know uh, help and assistance, especially from the government and the state. That's the first thing, this broad humanity. The second is his unrelenting critique of the state and the agents of the state, whether these are parliamentarians, politicians, leaders, judges, corporate types, and so on and so forth, who are in league with government, and against corruption, against exploitation, and so on and so forth. It's an unrelenting critique. And what is interesting about this critique is that it's never calling for revolution. He's never saying, break everything down. He is, as it were, talking to the people he's criticizing. And in that sense, he reminds me most of one of my favorite novelists, who's Dickens. Dickens was somebody who criticized the bourgeoisie, but he criticized the bourgeoisie to the bourgeoisie, as it were. Now, one can have endless debates as to whether this kind of critique is useful or not. One can have endless debates about whether, by criticizing the bourgeoisie, you're not actually perpetuating that same way of looking at things. Some would say, well, there's no point calling for revolution, because revolution just creates a situation where no progress can take place. Others might say, no, when things go really wrong, there's no other option but to go in for revolution. Yet others might say, well, as I said, you're just making the bourgeoisie feel happy about it. Look, I admit that I'm a hypocrite, and just by the mere admission of it, you kind of feel, you've done your bit, instead of trying to change the way in which you live. So that's the third thing that I wanted to say about Narayan. So first, his broad humanism; second, his unrelenting critique of the state; and third, the way in which he was, as it were, uh, bringing his enemies to him, quote unquote enemies to him. The people whom he was criticizing were the people who would be reading his cartoons. He was an extremely self-aware and conscious artist. Uh, and for that, I think we have to be grateful to him. There's much that is to be learned from him, including perhaps how not to go about doing things, how not to, make these tactical moves, as he did during the emergency. He was never imprisoned, although he was called up a couple of times, and this described very funnily in his autobiography, for cartoons which, by one ministry of the government, which had actually been applauded by another ministry. So the kind of absurdist drama that is our lives was reflected very accurately in his work. I think I've run out of time, because he said about 45 minutes or thereabouts, and I've exhausted that those 45 minutes, and I'll stop here. I think there's so much to say that.
Dr. Das, I think we can go on listening, But I think you've opened up quite a lot for these children to really delve into, and maybe you've triggered their interest to go and actually look at his books and
Yeah.
read some of the things. But if you are willing, Dr. Das, then it would be very nice if we could do a very brief Q&A with the
Yeah,
children
yeah,
in case
yeah,
they
yeah.
have any.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Right.
I'm quite happy to.
Right. So there is a child from Mahadevi Birla World Academy, Oshmita, I think. She's raised her hand. So,
Yeah.
Oshmita, you can ask Dr. Das your question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Sir,
Welcome.
I would like to ask you, why was Lakshman known as the Pied Piper of Delhi? As I have read that he was known as the Pied Piper of Delhi. So, why was he known as that?
I have no idea. This is the first time I'm hearing this. But I suppose one reason could be what I was saying, that like just as the Pied Piper leads people, rats and then children. I suppose Lakshman would also be something like that. You give people pleasure and lead them a particular way. But the story of the Pied Piper is actually a horrible story, isn't it? Kills of all the kids and things like that. Anyway, yeah, a couple of others have raised hands. So quick questions from them. I don't know.
Uh,
Shopney.
we
Yeah.
have,
There's Shopnil Ghosh, I think, who has a
yeah,
question, Dr. Das. So,
yeah,
Shopnil, please ask.
yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, ma'am, and thank you so much, Professor Das. So what I was wondering, like you said, that one distinction maybe about Lakshman is that he was not political in his work. So I was wondering if there are any other significant distinctions between him and other famous cartoonists, particularly maybe foreign cartoonists,
Well,
which might have led to different trends in cartoons in India and abroad.
yeah, no, see, I did I say he was not political? I said he was not he was charged with not being political enough.
Not openly political, I guess. Yeah.
He was not, uh, he was very political, in the sense that he was constantly, and in fact, if you read his autobiography, he talks about how he wanted to be a political cartoonist, and he uses the word political in a very broad sense. But his politics was what you could characterize as middle class politics, as it were. Broad socialist, leftist kind of attitudes, but never the kind of bitter attacks. I've mentioned Robert Trump. One magazine in the US, particularly in the 60s and 70s, exemplified the kind of hard-hitting political commentary that cartoonists sometimes can and do display, is Mad Magazine. I don't know whether you've seen Mad Magazine. A lot of it is available online now, and their satires and critiques are really pretty harsh. In Britain, in the 1970s and 80s, there was this television show called Spitting Image, which again was very, very harsh. So Lakshman was not like that. But to say that he was not a political cartoonist would be wrong. He was a political cartoonist, but if you look at cartoonists working in India now, like Nainan or Honappa, they are far more directly political. They name parties, they name individuals, which Lakshman sometimes did, but always keeping in mind the position that that person held. So he would not attack a particular politician because of his or her views, no matter how unacceptable. He would attack the chief minister of a state, or the prime minister of the country, or maybe the leader of the opposition. But the kind of bitter attacks on individual politicians that we see sometimes is was not present. As for cartoonists abroad, see, there's always this difficulty in that, when we say abroad, we typically mean the developed countries of Western Europe and North America. But abroad is also Nigeria. Abroad is also the Philippines. Abroad is also Bangladesh. And much depends on the political situation which is present in a country. What what a lot of people, Kenneth Tynan said this many years ago in the 60s, is that, uh, when you have a country such as, for example, the United States of America or the United Kingdom, where your freedom of speech is protected, you can protest all you like and it just falls by the wayside. It is really under conditions of, uh, some form of oppression that the best political literature, songs, music, and and cartoons have flourished. So, for example, in the Soviet Union, um, under communist rule, in Poland, in Hungary, if you look at the cartoonists in from Poland and Hungary during the quote unquote communist regimes, there were this. In fact, some of the greatest works that we still read today, written 400, 500 years ago, whatever, were written under oppressive regimes. Shakespeare being the classic example. Shakespeare didn't live in a free society. Shakespeare was constantly aware of the fact that he could be persecuted or even executed if he said something. So you had to find creative ways of going around these forms of censorship and so on and so forth. So it's a fraught question. I would say that it's difficult to generalize because every society, every culture has its historical specificities where you're allowed to say certain things, not allowed to, quote unquote, allowed, not allowed to say some certain things, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry, that's doesn't really answer your question, but I think it might help you to think through the ramifications of your question better. Yeah.
Next, we have Viren Mukherjee from La Matinee for Boys.
Yeah.
Viren?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So, sir, I was asking, did Mr. Lakshman want his cartoons to be viewed only by the people who knew exactly who Mahatma Gandhi and Indira Gandhi were, or did he also want it to be viewed fundamentally as a depiction of political leaders and freedom fighters and the common man by
Okay.
someone who has no idea of who Indira Gandhi and Mahatma Gandhi is?
Um, I think, and please don't take it otherwise. I'm not attacking you personally, but that is a kind of elite position to take. What makes you assume that a person in a village doesn't know who Indira Gandhi or who Mahatma Gandhi is? We sometimes think, this kind of us and them division is something I come across. It's well-meaning. It's well-meaning. Your question is well-meaning, but you need to ask yourself, maybe somebody who's an auto driver or somebody who works at home, you'd often be surprised at how much they know about the present political situation, often more than us, because political decisions impact or have an impact on their lives in many more direct ways than they do typically on our lives. So that is the first point I'd like to make. Secondly is that what you say about whether he wanted it or not, for any artist, this ultimately is a redundant question, because the moment you've created a work of art, whether it's a grand painting 6 feet by whatever, like Guernica by Picasso, or Jokka Jokki by Ramkinkar Bej, or something much smaller, like a little Fabergé egg, or one of Lakshman's cartoons. The moment it sort of goes out into the world, and especially works of art which are reproducible. That is to say, it's not a one-off piece. It's not a specific sculpture which is made for some big industrialist or tycoon to be displayed in his whatever weekend getaway house, which artists do, and perfectly legitimately. If it is something that can be reproduced, like a book, like a play, like a little video clip, like a cartoon, and so on and so forth, once it's out in the world, you know it's impossible for the artist to ensure its reception. People will look at it in various ways. I don't know if you guys listen to rock and roll. I love it. And in our time, there was a man called Bruce Springsteen. He's still around. He's still playing.
Yes.
And Springsteen in 1984 released USA, whose title track, Born in the USA, was a bitter indictment of America about the Vietnam.
America.
it was something which totally criticized the American quote unquote dream. This was used in political rallies by Ronald Reagan to talk about, yeah, born in the USA, how great it is. Springsteen was aghast, but he could not, control it. So I don't really think whether the question as to whether Lakshman wanted it or not is is very pertinent. I'm sure he wanted everyone to read his cartoons, because let us remember that in his early cartooning career he wasn't writing for the English medium press. He wrote for Malayalam and he wrote for Kannada magazines as well. But the thing is that Lakshman's cartoons appeared in a medium, an English language newspaper, or on the covers of books written in English, including most famously by his brother R.K. Narayan and some of his friends, which were, or which circulated, shall we say, amongst a particular class and in a particular area. It is very unlikely that the average, quote unquote, average villager in, say, Udupi or in Medinipur would ever get to see a Lakshman cartoon. Uh, that is the unfortunate, perhaps, truth of the matter. But as I said right on, early on in this little meandering talk of mine, Lakshman cartoons were translated, or at least the captions of his cartoons were translated into various languages. That, of course, again brings up the problem. A substantial proportion of our fellow Indians is illiterate. So maybe they would be able to look at the illustrations and not read what was being said. So yeah, so these were some of the problems, but I think by and large Lakshman was and has remained largely an urban, relatively elite phenomenon, which does not necessarily detract from what he did. Don't think that everybody has to go out and create biplab in the, among the Matir Manush in the villages. That is not always necessary. Yeah.
Next, we have Rishit Soni, also from Lamatnya for Boys.
Okay.
All right. So, Dr. Das, my question to you essentially is that after Lakshman's death, there has been a lot of change in the socio-political scenario of the country. Now there is a lot of debate regarding censorship by the government on mass media. Not only that, we have also heard a lot of stories about a lot of cartoonists, authors, especially political cartoonists and satirists being caught under various laws, under various sections. Right. So my question to you essentially is that despite all of these limitations, despite this sudden change that has happened in the socio-political scenario of the country, do you think there is still a prospect of another R.K. Lakshman actually rising and growing despite all of these problems that mass media faces today?
Yes, except that R.K. Laxman may not be a cartoonist. Let me give you the instance of somebody whose works I'm sure some of you or a lot of you will have seen. Veer Das, the stand-up comedian. I don't know if you haven't seen him, look him up. He is doing the kind of things that R.K. Laxman did in his own time. Veer speaks in English. He addresses a largely urban elite audience, but he's talking precisely about the kinds of things that you were saying. So, because the nature of media has changed, R.K. Laxman wrote at a time when the primary medium for understanding the world, or indeed India, for educated middle/upper middle class Indians was the newspaper. That is no longer, or no longer necessarily the case. I wonder how many of you get a physical newspaper in your homes, and even if you do, how many of you read it? And even if you do read it, is it the primary mode of your accessing news and information about the world? I don't know. I read the newspaper every day, but increasingly I find myself looking at my mobile phone and news feeds and so on and so forth for gathering information from various sources. And we live in the age of information overload. So when Lakshman was cartooning for the Times of India, from the 50s right up to the 20 teens, at least, for the first 4.5 decades or so of his cartooning career, he was working almost unchallenged, as it were. Now there are so many uh, people working in so many different media. The kind of critique and the kind of criticism, the kind of satire that you speak of when you speak of a Lakshman is increasingly appearing in other forms. I mentioned Veer Das. In our context, there is another comedian, Hassan Minaj, in the US, who used to have a show which has been withdrawn by Netflix, and it is political, it is direct, it is also funny, and so on and so forth. So the short answer to your question is, I'm sure there will be someone, more than one person, who's equivalent to R.K.Laxman, except that I'm not sure that she or he will be working in the same medium as he did.
We have Shaivi Kumar from Shrishi Academy, Dr. Das, next.
Yeah, okay. Shelley,
Thank you,
go
sir.
ahead.
It was a pleasure and an honor to hear you. Sir, my question to you is, do you find any relation between the common man and the uncommon man? Because when we look at the common man, a lot of his features, facial features, they kind of we can relate, and
Mhm.
they are kind of similar to what Mr. Lakshman looked like. And so, did you ever think about it, and could you ever find any connection between the two, and could you relate?
Did the common man look like Lakshman? No, I mean Lakshman had a full head of hair right up to when he died. This guy has this bald, is bald and has this fringe on
So
the side.
some of his facial features, I just find them to be, a little similar.
Well, perhaps, especially the line of the mouth and the chin and so on and so forth. But then all our
Yes.
facial features have something in common in that sense. Yeah. So, s- well, the common man, it has often been said, is sort of Lakshman's alter ego. It is one way in which the cartoonist enters the frame of his cartoon, as it were. That is one way of looking at it. Uh, and what do you mean by the uncommon man? I mean, is this? I didn't quite get your question when you say the uncommon man. Um,
I was asking that his cartoon, it had the common man, and Lakshman
yeah.
himself was an uncommon man. So, do you find any
Okay.
connection between?
No, see, the common man, the genesis of the common man is interesting. Lakshman realized that he needed to have representatives from, quote unquote, from India in his cartoons. But then when he started to think about it and when he started to draw them, he realized that there was such a vast amount of difference in the physiques, in the complexions, in the clothes, in the body language of people. And he actually gives you a list in his autobiography, I think, or in one of his essays, that he didn't really know how to go about it. You know, and then one day, as he had these, 6 or 7 figures on his page, and he was drawing, and he started to abstract certain elements, and suddenly he was left with 2 or 3, and finally with just this one person. And that was a sort of eureka moment. He said, yes, okay, this guy is going to stand in for everybody. And if you look at the common man's ensemble, the clothes that he wears, it's rather strange, how many people wear a coat in India. It's as if he exists only in winter, but it sort of works, and he's got the dhoti. The one other character which whom I would relate with the common man is the tramp in Chaplin. The tramp sort of becomes representative of every man, as it were, except, of course, the tramp is uh, designedly poor, whereas the common man is not necessarily poor. We don't think of him as wealthy, but he's probably somebody like an upper division clerk or something like that, somebody who's getting along. No, maybe lives in rented accommodation, maybe lives in quarters given to him by his sarkari employers. So he becomes representative of the urban common person in India. So the creation of the common man was, according to Lakshman, the need to create an image of the Indian everyman, if you know what I mean. And in doing this, he was extremely successful. Need to keep in mind, of course, that there is no feminine equivalent, no female equivalent of the common man there. So this was one, according to Lakshman. But according to what I have been saying to you, the common man can be seen, as I said, as one way in which the cartoonist, as it were, himself steps into the frame of his cartoons and sort of directs your gaze. Uh, we have to learn how to read a cartoon, just as we have to learn how to read a film or how to read a book. And often when you go back to a cartoon, you realize there is more to that cartoon than you earlier thought, or sometimes there is less to the cartoon than you had earlier thought. And in every single cartoon, every single image with the common man in it, the common man subtly kind of directs you, or lets you know which way he is looking. You may or may not follow that. The good thing about somebody who's helping you to interpret, such as I am at this moment, is that you don't necessarily have to follow that person. So everything that I have said is my opinion, is my view, and you can disagree entirely with it. In fact, I'll be happiest if you disagreed with me, because that would make me happy, because that means you are thinking for yourself. You're looking at the world for yourself, and that's what the common man helps you to do. He looks at the world from a particular perspective. He's very often the person who's speaking, whose speech is given at the bottom of the cartoon. And you are free to accept what he's saying, to adopt his perspective, to modify it, or to reject it altogether.
Dr. Das, we'll take the last question for this morning, and it's from Himraj Chakraborty. Himraj, it's over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, I wanted to ask, like, I've seen some of, actually many of Lakshman's cartoons, and in some cartoons, it is shown that the common man wears like a coat and the dhoti, while in one cartoon, I've seen the caption, I think, was "Donate generously and remove poverty." In that, he is shown like very poor, like he's wearing tattered clothes, and also why this sudden change in the like how
See,
he is being depicted.
I will not be able to comment unless I see that. Do you have that? Can you show that? Can you present that image?
Present, I don't have it right now, sir.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So one reason could simply be that he just thought that it was time to show the common man dressed in the kind of rags or tattered clothes that unfortunately so many Indians are still dressed in today. So that could be a very simple explanation for that. I suspect that is probably the explanation, but it would not be correct of me to comment on it without looking at the image, because as I've tried to indicate to you right at the beginning, there is a richness to his images which repay a certain careful examination of the elements that go into the composition of each one of his frames. I think there's a last question.
Yes, sure, Dr. Das. I think it's Proyag Ghosh. We'll ask Proyag.
Sir, thank you for the excellent session and all the information that you provided us with. So I wanted to ask that the goal of people like R.K.Laxman and all other representatives of the political representatives were to prove and show the people's voice over the time, and also make information more accessible to them. So now in this age of age of social media, it has become a lot more prominent and much more easier for the people to access news information and also express their voice. So do you think that his goals and his thoughts have been have been achieved, or in the way of being achieved?
See, I don't think Lakshman thought in terms of goals and so on and so forth. He was a self-taught artist, as I have mentioned. He wanted to draw. He knew that he wanted to be a regular cartoonist, preferably a political cartoonist. And he chased that dream and he realized it. And he was very fortunate, as he says, that when he was working in the Times of India, there were no restrictions put on what he could depict or not depict, unlike when he was working, let's say, in the Free Press Journal or even for a while in Blitz. So he was free to express what he wanted to. And his vision was one of a largely, what you might call a Nehruvian, or a, Nehruvian socialist kind of India, where there is justice for all, where people have a decent, you know, living, can make a decent living, where hypocrisy is absent, where there is no corruption, where there is none of the exploitation, which unfortunately is so much of a feature of India. And there are many artists, many musicians, filmmakers, and so on and so forth, who are trying to do that. Art always has a kind of tangential relationship to life. I happen to know, happen to have friends who are artists, some of them fairly well known. And one of the questions that always comes up, not always, often comes up, when they're, what do you hope for your art to achieve? Um, and most of them would say, we are trying to express our vision of a certain kind of, liberal, secular, democratic kind of India, and so on and so forth. But can art actually help to achieve it? This is a question which is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to answer. If you think about the countries which saw the rise of fascism, let's say, in Germany under Hitler, if you look at Germany before that, it had some of the greatest artists the world had ever produced. It had a Beethoven, it had a Goethe, it had so many brilliant scientists, thinkers, not just the world famous ones who are there. And yet this terrible ideology and this terrible system arose. So it is impossible for anybody, however much we might want to assert that art can make a better society. Art can build, whatever ism you want, you want to build. What art can do, I think, at best, is to make us think. It can raise certain issues which maybe we were not aware of. And it ultimately is up to us as individuals and as collectives to try and make the world a better place, and our country and our state and our school and our community a better place. Sorry to sound like a preacher.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das. I'll now request Mrs. Prasad to wrap up the session for this morning.
Uh, Professor Das, I don't think I can find appropriate words to thank you for such a stimulating session. It's been a wonderful morning. Thank you for helping us to appreciate the sheer artistry of Lakshman's cartoons, for helping us to notice certain details which I think would have perhaps escaped us if it hadn't been for your insights. And most of all, thank you for helping all of us to be able to think critically and to be able to appreciate some of the nuances which are there in the cartoons. I think this is exactly why we had this session planned. And I think this opportunity to listen to you has exceeded all our expectations. And I know you were very apprehensive about whether or not you would share anything new, but I think on behalf of all of us, I can say there's been an enormous amount of learning, and in such a joyful environment that it's a big, big thank you to us. Um, I would also like to express my thanks to Mr. Raman for sparing the time to be with us today. Um, to all the teachers and the students from the participating schools, please do convey our thanks to your principals for allowing you time off from your classes. I think it's been a wonderful morning with a huge amount of learning that has happened. Uh, and before we close, I would like to express my appreciation to the IT support staff from Indus Valley World School who've been quietly working behind the scenes to manage all the tech support. And last but most importantly, thank you very much to our principal, Mrs. Reshma Bhattacharya, and to our Dean of Arts, Ms. Priyadarshini Guha. They have been instrumental in helping us to put this whole event together. So thank you once again to everyone present. And I'm sure we're all going to be reflecting on all the things that we have heard from Professor Das long after this session is over. Thank you
And,
once again.
and I'd like to thank everybody present for giving me this opportunity, because opportunities like this, sort of force you to put your thoughts in order, which I loved. And thank you all for being a patient audience. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you, sir. Namaskar, sir. Thank you.